Douglas Marston.
Okay, well, I'll introduce myself. Let me give you a little bit of my background. Remember the list of names of students, grad students that Stan had up there earlier. I think there were about 8 grad students plus Gary Derman, but I was one of those 8. I was lucky enough to work with Stan. And I remember quite vividly sitting there at the table in the old law school. That's what happened. The law school got a brand new facility, so education got the old law school library. And I remember sitting at one of those long wooden tables, listening to Stan talk about vital signs, and talk about those growth charts, the weight and height charts. And he assured me that if you ever went into the pediatrician's office, that you would see one of those growth charts. And so 8, 9, 10 years later, when my son was born, and my wife and I took our son into the pediatrician, sure enough, they pulled out one of those growth charts. So, but I remember running with Jerry Tyndall, and we talked about vital signs of education. What is that all about? So, anyway, those were very fun times. I'm also the one that didn't go on to an academic position. All those names, they're pretty much all those people. I went on to Vanderbilt, Oregon, Wisconsin, so on and so forth. Instead, I took the road less traveled. I went to Australia. I'm going to spend a year in Australia with my wife and working. And so when I came back, which was midwinter, it really wasn't a time to move into any open positions. I sort of tagged on to the Minneapolis Public Schools. They were interested in this model that Stan and all of us had been working on, curriculum-based measurement. So I got hired part-time working in the Minneapolis schools to help get some of this stuff going. And sure enough, that little part-time job, which I was only going to do for a year, turned into 2 years, 3 years, and now 20 years. And so I've been in the Minneapolis schools. When I got hired, my official title was, well, let me back up a little bit. I got to explain a little bit about titles in Minneapolis schools. They're a little bit different than other schools. They have an acronym for everything there. And for teachers on special assignment, teachers that are out of the classroom working in the district office, they're called TOSAs, T-O-S-A, TOSAs, teachers on special assignment. If there's a principal that's working out of the central office, they're principals on special assignments. So they're HOSAs, P-O-S-A. Well, I was a psychologist, and so couldn't use POSA because the principals had it. So they called us psychosis. And so I had to live with that job title for a number of years. Although about 6, 7 years ago, I got kicked upstairs and now an administrator in the special education department. I wanted to start with a cartoon. Believe it or not, Stan talked a lot about the history of CBM, and I actually have a cartoon that relates to the topic of history. It's a cave boy comes home from cave school and is talking to his cave mother, and he says, "Hey, school's not bad. Looks like history's going to be my easiest subject." And sort of sneaks up on you. And I got to think a little bit. CBM's like that. The history is really quite brief when you compare it to the history of IQ tests, achievement testing, which have been going on for well over 100 years. I think Renee was doing work in the 1890s. This all got started with Stan's work back in the mid-70s. So it has been a brief history, but don't be fooled. There's been a lot of stuff going on in terms of developing that history. And Stan alludes to the fact that about 303 some published references to curriculum-based measurement are out there. And so what I want to do today is share with you how I have incorporated a lot of this work in the Minneapolis schools. And by the way, since Stan ran a little bit longer than we thought, actually the joke used to be when we presented back in grad school, never let Doug go first, because I had a history going way too long. So they always put me at the end, and that's why I'm at the end today. Payback. It's payback. It's right. You're getting it. These were the things that I wanted to address. I'm going to cut short some of these critical questions. I was going to talk about the importance of fluency, the importance of formative evaluation, and we'll just briefly touch on those. But these are really the areas I'm going to share data with you that we've been collecting in the Minneapolis schools, and how it relates to high-stakes testing, how it can be used in special populations such as Title I, special education, ELL, how schools use CBM for school-wide assessment, school improvement plans, how it fits into something called the problem-solving model, and disproportionate issues. And we'll see how our time goes, because I do definitely want to be done by noon, and I think we definitely want to have time for questions. So I did want to share a couple of quotes. I think a person that we want to talk a little bit about is Jay Samuels. Jay talked a lot about fluency and the importance of its relationship with comprehension. And just wanted to share some of the things that he'd been saying. And sure enough, the CBM model fits in quite nicely with a lot of things that Jay was talking about. He also notes that as less attention is required for decoding, more attention becomes available for comprehension. Let's move up a notch. We'll go through this chronologically. By the way, I did delete most of these during the intermission, so I'm not sure why they're still there. But so much for my grasp of the technology. Nation of Readers talked about the importance of decoding and fluency. And of course, we see it in the National Reading Panel also, which cites NAEP, the Pinnell study that was done back in the mid-90s. And we talk about that fluency is an important component of overall reading ability and is strongly linked to reading comprehension. Of course, the Every Child, the Action Plan for the Learning First Alliance talks about the importance of curriculum-based assessments, and this hints at the importance of formative assessment, being able to take a look at data on a frequent basis to see if our instruction is effective or not. And you made the point, you asked about the kinds of changes that you make and looking at the data and teachers looking at the effectiveness. That's a huge step, because while in special education, for the most part, teachers I think have a very strong data-based orientation. That's not the way it works in regular education, as most of you know. And so this is a different orientation. This is a different paradigm. And I've spent a lot of time in regular ed sittings over the last 10 years talking with teachers about how they can look at the data and make judgments about whether kids are growing or not. And then the last quote I'm going to share with you comes from Gusky, who talks about teachers who develop useful assessments, provide corrective instructions, that is, respond to the data, and give students second chances, can improve their instruction and help students to learn. So what we've been doing in Minneapolis is we initially, back when I started in the early 80s, is we trained our teachers in special education to collect data on a frequent basis like this, and Stan shared some charts with you also. And so vertical lines typically represent, if they don't represent a break of some sort, they represent a change in instruction or possibly a change in the measurement level. So we've trained teachers to do that. Now, one of the issues that came up, and Stan talked about this a little bit, is comprehension. And so this is a cartoon that actually Stan distributed to all of us on the team. And it kind of hits it. There's the guy reading off the letters. Yeah, I can read it fine, but I'm worried about my comprehension. So I just threw this in here to let you know that we have attended to that issue, and we have built in curriculum-based measurement type measures that can be used on a repeated basis quickly across time in these three areas. We have something called a reading expression rubric. I'll share information on that with you. We also do standard comprehension questions and the maze comprehension that Stan talked about. So I'm only going to talk just briefly about this reading expression rubric that we have teachers do after they listen to the child read. What we do is we try we call it a measure of prosody, and that comes from, I think Jay Samuels talked about prosody. And we did some correlational analyses. We had teachers rate kids how well they read with expression, proper inflection after doing that 1-minute sample. And then Jerry and I published an article on exceptionality in the mid-90s that reports on those correlations, which were moderate to high. And the rubric looks something like this, going from 1 to 5, reading single words, no flow, very choppy, all the way to following stop signs in the text, having appropriate ending, and reading with expression. Our comprehension measures are very basic in terms of the questions, and then, of course, we also have available maze All right, now I want to get to the 5 areas and talk about how we utilize the data, what we've learned over the last 20-some years. Okay, well, in Minnesota we have high-stakes testing just like every other state. The high-stakes testing takes 2 forms for us. We have something called the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment. It's a series of standardized tests, mostly objective items, multiple choice, but there are some open-ended items. That is short answer. Then we have those in reading and math of grades 3 and 5. Now these are used for statewide accountability. These are the measures that could put a school into AYP, and AYP meaning lack of adequate yearly progress as it relates to No Child Left Behind. These are the tests that the schools need to take a look at. So it's high stakes for the schools, not for the student, but for the schools. And then at high school level, we have the Minnesota Basic Standards Test. These are graduation tests, so they're high stakes for individuals. Kids will not get their diploma if they do not pass this test. Those tests are started at grade 8, and you need 75% items correct if you're going to pass. I guess I didn't really describe the levels on the MCA. There are basically 5 different levels, levels 1, 2A, 2B, 3, and 4, going from not proficient to adequate to proficient to beyond proficient. And they've got scaled scores that correspond to these different levels. And I just wanted to educate you on this because I have some charts that talk about level 2A and 2B. The magic score is 1420. It's the dividing line here on this level 2, which is really what is considered to be proficiency. And schools need to be above 1420. So this is something that we're all really focused on in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, I hear, and all around the state, because obviously schools want to stay off of AYP. So I'm going to share data with you that shows how we've done correlations and taken a look. That's just a sample output that you get from the state. Every school gets a report on the percentage of kids that they have at level 1, level 2A, 2B, 3, and 4. And as you can see, for the most part, we have a lot of kids at level 1 and 2A that really are not deemed proficient, okay? And so that's where a good part of the game is at for us. And that's the Minnesota data. In Minneapolis, where we have 70% poverty, where we have probably about 65% students of color, actually growing higher than that, almost 30% ELL. We have a lot more kids at levels 1 and at level 2A. And so what we've been trying to do is get teachers to follow student performance on CBM to see if kids are making progress towards these important levels. We've run a lot of correlational analyses, and here, for example, is the correlation between words read correct for 3rd graders and the MCA reading scaled score. Ranges from 800 to 2200, and of course there's 1420, that sort of magic cut line that we're all taking a good look at. We pick up 56% of the variance, so the initial correlation is like 0.75. So it's fairly strong. Now here's an analysis, and what we did was we asked the question, well, what percentage of kids get over 1420 based on their words correct? Okay, for 3rd graders. Well, if you're a 3rd grade kid looking at that 3rd grade passage, by the way, our reading series is Hoot and Mifflin, and our passages have a whole lot of Hoot and Mifflin. And what we've done is we've got approximately 30 passages at every grade level. We've gone through and we made sure that they're roughly equivalent. There's always that readability problem. Publishers will like to tell you that we have all equivalent passages within grade levels, but we all know that there is a lot of unevenness there. So we've done a lot of our own readability studies, and we've made sure we've had a fairly consistent set of passages at each grade level. Well, anyway, so 3rd grader, if you're reading less than 30 words correct, only about 2 or 3% of the kids in that group, and this is based on several hundred kids, by the way. We've got over 20,000 kids in Minneapolis where we're collecting CBM data. They're not going to be over 1420. If we skip forward, you get kids reading in that 60 to 70 word range, it's about half and half. About half of those kids are getting over 14, 20. Okay? If you get third graders reading in the 100 word range, we're up to 85, 90% of those kids are about 14, 20. So what we do is we work with our schools, and our schools collect data fall, winter, and spring, and they take a look at this kind of data to check their own progress towards the AYP cut line. This is the same kind of analysis for 5th grade, except you see that the words correct begins to inch up. So for the 5th graders, if they're going to be 90% chance of getting above that magic 14-20 score, they're going to have to be in the 110, 120 range. Now we did a similar analysis with the Minnesota Basic Standards test. And by the way, the 14-20 roughly equates to passing the 8th grade test. At least that's what the state's telling us, okay? So it's basically the same kind of analysis. Whether you pass or not pass that MBST is a lot like being above or below the 14-20. And our data is very similar. Again, in this one we did a quadratic, but we captured about 55% of the variance. Again, correlations in the mid-70s. We asked ourselves, gee, now it would be interesting to kind of take a look inside the data. You know, what do the special groups look like? Where do they reside? Green dots are general ed kids, and for the most part, by the way, the scaled score for passing was 600 on this test. So for the most part, a good chunk of the kids that are passing are general ed, and that of course is not surprising. Our blue, purple triangles are ELL students. They tend to be more on the failing side. Special ed, we've got a few of those black dots. For the most part, they're all on this side of the equation. I'm sorry, special ed is, special ed and ELL, and then the red diamond is special education. Okay.
I'm puzzled by people who pass the test with high scores but are well below the line. And there's not just a few of them. I'm puzzled about that.
People, okay, which ones are we talking about?
Right hand below what looks like the general ed line.
Okay.
There's, not the majority, but there's an interesting number of people
that
did well on the test but didn't do the words right.
But for the most part, these are the people that have passed the test. For the most part, these people are going to have to be 100 words and above.
Oh, I'm reading the.
Yeah.
Right, I got the transpose in my head. Got it.
All right. And then we did a similar analysis with that I showed you for 3rd and 5th grades, similar for 8th graders and how well they did on the MBST. And what's interesting, to get 80 to 90% passing for those kids, they're up in the 150 range. Okay, so that's information that we feed back to our schools. Now, what we've done is we've sort of feathered together 3 databases here, and we've come up with some generalizations on where kids need to be if they have an 85% chance of either being above 14-20 or passing that MBST. Because we've been collecting data for years and years on this, we've been able to take 8th graders that took the test and go back and look at their previous CBM performance when they were in 7th, 6th, 5th grade. And then because we have 5th graders who take that MCA test, we've got CBM data on them going back 4 or 5 years, and the same with our 3rd grade test. And so we put that all together, feathered it together, as I like to say, and we've come up with some numbers that really seem to be key. And then what we do is we then turn around, give that to our schools. A big part of our schools, we have over 60 elementaries, 7 middle schools, 7 high schools, is the school improvement plan. And of course this is just like everybody else in the country. But when you write those school improvement plans, you need to write goals. You need to identify problem areas and write goals for those areas. And of course our district standardized tests, achievement tests, play a big role in that. Of course our state tests play a big role in that. But one nice feature about the curriculum-based measurement is you can actually do growth within the year, because those tests that I just mentioned are really only once a year type administrations. Curriculum-based measurement. Okay, this is some data that we have on different groups. This takes a look at grades 1 through 6. Here's our special ed kids. And I'm sorry this doesn't show up very well. Here are kids that are Title I services and regular ed kids. In a way, this is a sort of form of divergent validity or discriminant validity. It's a way to validate you have a measure, because you would, beforehand, believe that these three groups would be distinctly different, and in fact they are on the curriculum-based measure. This looks at a large sample of 8th grade kids, and it's just another way of looking at the breakdown of ELL and special ed students. This is the total sample, and looks quite normal, and typically is. One thing we do know at the earlier grade levels, we do lose some of the normality, and they are somewhat skewed to the left. And what we have in red are ELL students, and then our special ed students here, which is really quite variable. Which is not surprising, because special education covers 11 categories of disability, and you do have a very wide range of abilities. It's just a scatter plot of those different those 11 different disability groupings and where they fall on the NCA. That, just looking at the special ed population, picked up 52% of the variation. Which I was a little bit surprised, because typically, one of the things I learned in stats class is, if you have a restricted sample when you're running correlations, you usually have a decline, but still fairly substantial correlation. Now I'm just going to give you some other examples of how we get the data back to the schools, encourage them to look at it. Because we've been doing this for years, we were able to look at slope, learning slope. This is data back to 1998, 99, fall, winter, spring, grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And these are resource students, special ed students. And so we're able to track that. And what we do is we feed back to our special ed teachers every year what the data looks like in program. As I look at this data, the thing that I see is really only marginal improvement across years. I don't see any improvement really for first and second grades. These slopes are all quite similar, but there seems to be something happening here with the older kids. There is a bit of an upswing from 1998 to 2001. Did the same kind of analysis for language groups. These are all kids in the district, fall to spring. These are all your ELL students. So you can see how they're really, it's quite a bit different group than the total group. And then we break it down by language group. We have a large population of Hmong students, Spanish speaking, and Somali. We're getting a lot of Somali students coming into Minneapolis. And the ELL group that seems to fare the best is the Hmong population. They're doing quite well. In fact, they're not much different than the total population. My theory on this is the Hmong are probably, they've been in the country the longest, because the Spanish, many of the Spanish and the Somali kids are just recently coming into the country, just moving into Minneapolis. The Hmong have been here probably a little bit longer and had more experience with the English language. Now this is kind of interesting. This is the total ELL. Stan loves this graph, because it really shows I guess sort of an interaction or a differential approach, differential impact for ELL students and for all students in Minneapolis. This is very similar to some of those graphs I've shown you earlier about the percent of kids that pass based on the words correct. And this really aggregates across the continuum. So the way to read this, for example, is kids reading at 60 words. If they're an ELL student, only about 30% of those kids are passing, whereas 60% are passing of the total sample. And what's interesting as we go down, as we look at words increasing up to 120, 130, at that point, the ELL and the regular ed group have roughly the same pass rates. So that means, something else is going on here with the Yale students as they acquire the English language, as they probably acquire more experience. And what it would mean is we probably would not want to be using the same standards, obviously, for these kids who are still struggling, still performing below 100 words, as opposed to these students. However, at the end point, at the end of the analysis, that still is critical. If you keep in mind that we would like to get all of our kids up to 85–90% pass rates, that still is a critical criterion for our students. Curriculum-based measurement and school progress monitoring. What we do is we analyze the data centrally for all of our students, and we get it back to the schools so that they get charts that look like this. Now what I've done is I've eliminated the names of the students down below, but each one of these represents a student. Fall data, red, purple triangle, winter data. And then it rank orders all the kids based on their initial performance in the fall and shows how much they grew. Now that's one class, it's a third grade class. And then what schools can do is they do their school improvement plan and take a look at those charts. They can talk about the instruction that's going on, and that's where you get into the issues. Talk about, well, what are you doing? Why are you getting this kind of growth and I'm not? And that can't. I mean, as Stan said, that data doesn't tell you what to teach, but it gets you talking about the data, thinking about it, and thinking about what are the interventions that you're using. Okay, are you using some direct instruction? Are you using? You have a strong dose of phonemic awareness, grades 1 and 2. Are you using sort of success as a popular one that we use in our school? Or are you just staying in the hoop and curriculum and not varying from the scope and sequence?
Now, what is going on, though, at the school level to support teachers having that conversation? Because that in itself is revolutionary.
Yeah, great question. There is a group of us in Minneapolis who have been promoting this. And actually, we got to promote it through something called the problem-solving model. And actually, I also got to promote it through the Office for Civil Rights, who came and visited us about 5 or 6 years ago. And the Office for Civil Rights said, you need to spend more time looking at kids that are struggling in reading and math and coming up with interventions in general ed. So that gave us an opportunity to sort of link this data with that and go out and have those discussions. And so I'm going to cover that a little bit as we go through this. Okay, and that's yet another chart. And of course, you might, as a teacher looks at this data, he or she might go, well, these two kids were really not too different at the beginning of the year. This one only grew that much, but that one that much. What's going on? And let's talk about that. And then we can take a look at classrooms. We put this data together. So this is room 210, 212, 233. And obviously, you don't want to do this in a sort of a blaming way, saying, hey, 212 is doing better than 210, but you do it in such a way that you have collegial discussions through your professional development plans, through your school improvement plans, and you talk about what can be done. Again, this is interesting. These two classes started about the same place in the fall, but yet 210 was growing more than the other one. So let's talk about the instructional issues. Let's talk about the kids and take it from there. And then you can compare by schools at the next level, okay? And this is an analysis where we're looking at letter sounds, and this represents winter data. Actually, we had one school collected some fall data, but by and large, at the time that we collected this, we were only doing letter sounds in winter and spring. We're now doing letter sounds in the fall. But you could contrast the schools, and these are all schools, by the way, that all were fairly similar in terms of poverty, so on and so forth. So what's going on at this school that, is not going on here, okay? So then you take the level of analysis to up a notch. At this point, I think I'll breeze through these pretty quickly. I just wanted to make the point that we've also been working a lot in early literacy. The model that we worked on with Stan was pretty much words correct, and then we moved it to Maze and other areas, and it was pretty much grades 1 through 6, 1 through 8. But of course, there's a lot of a lot of effort and activity going on at kindergarten and pre-kindergarten, and I just pulled a quote about the importance of phonemic awareness. I pulled that out of National Reading Panel. And what we did is, about 4 years ago, we started doing our own research on letter sounds, onset phonemes. That's if I will tell you a word and you'll give me the first sound. If I say the word cat, you will say k, okay? And the segmentation is really the next level of onset phoneme identification. I give you the word cat, and the kid says k, and there's 3 phonemes. And so we developed probes for that, and we measured student growth on those, and we ran validity and reliability studies. We looked at reliability, test, retest, and the test retest was separated by a couple of weeks. We ran it with Iterator, with teachers, and we got some pretty good data. Small sample size, but still looks pretty good. Intercorrelations among those measures are high, and that's not terribly surprising because there's a lot of similarity among those measures. So what's really critical is how well do these measures predict later performance in reading. So we're doing that work now, and this is just sort of the start of that. So we looked at those kids in the spring of kindergarten and how well they did in first grade. And we had 2 different measures of how well they were doing in first grade. And keeping in mind that, there's still not a whole lot of, reading per se going on in first grade, we still looked at words correct for CBM. And we looked at the teacher ratings. These are just the ratings off the report card, okay? Understanding what is read, using phonics skills, analyzing what is read, reads fluently with expression. That was the teacher rating the kids on 1, 2, 3, or 4, putting it on the report card. We correlated back to the spring. And then we looked at words correct. We had some schools that were collecting words correct data first grade in regular ed. And we had some pretty healthy correlations. The segmentation was 0.82, which was quite high. So what we've done is a fair amount of work establishing. And then so what we've done is we've given this data back to the teachers. What we've done is we've given them the growth chart. There it is again. And 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile. But of course you can't stop there, because if you're in a school district that's low performing, that may be, to be at the 75th percentile, it may not be good enough. And so we also went to the literature. There was some research out at the University of Oregon that we borrowed from, and they had some benchmarks. And so we've also established that. So we give these charts to our kindergarten teachers and our first grade teachers and encourage them to collect the data. And actually what we're doing now, because you don't train kindergarten teachers to collect this data overnight, we're actually collecting the data for them. We have cadres that go out fall, winter, and spring, and we have these kindergarten assessments. We take the data, we write the reports, and get it back to them. But that's been very interesting in itself, because most kindergarten teachers come out of a developmental model where social skills and socialization is paramount, as opposed to some of the basic skills things that we're talking about here. So that's...
What are the monthly data points?
Pardon?
So what are the monthly
the monthly data points, what we did is we had fall, winter, spring data. I mean, we borrowed a page from the test publishers and extrapolated, or is it interpolated? Actually, it's both. And make, develop these growth lines. And we've got it for phoneme segmentation in grade 1 also. We've got letter sounds. And so anyway, just so that you can see in your mind, here's some data that we collected in 2001 across the district. We got 3,000 kids in this sample, kindergarten kids. They're only averaging 2 correct letter sounds. Was it 3.2, but they jumped up to almost 30 by the spring. Before that, we weren't collecting any data like this at all at kindergarten. So it's leading us into new territory. And all I've done here basically is plot the fall, winter, spring means that we have from our data for kindergarten and first grade across those 3 measures that I shared with you. I just did this just to kind of get a sense of what the units or the scale looks like. For kindergarten, it looks like it's very similar. There's not much difference in those means across time. It does begin to differ in first grade. It's kind of interesting that the onset phonemes really falls off, whereas letter sounds and phoneme segmentation has a larger scale. Curriculum-based measurement in the problem-solving model. Well, I'm going to go through this really fast. let me just briefly tell you that, and this gets at your question about, how do you talk about this data? Roughly 10 years ago, we got a waiver from our State Department of Education. And let me step back one more step here. In our state, IQ tests are typically required for disability determination for a number of our categories. Because we have a very diverse population in Minneapolis, we thought we should maybe look at some other kind of data instead of or in addition to IQ tests. And what we did is we went to our State Department and said, we would like to really build a model that looks a lot at pre-referral data, at data in general ed, and looks at response to instruction, and use kids' slope of learning and growth as a way of determining whether they need more intensive services or not. And so the problem-solving model defined and analyzed the problem, developing a hypothesis about it, trying different interventions, collecting data and evaluating outcomes as necessary, was something that we told the state that we would like to do, called the problem-solving model. Iowa had been doing that back in the early 90s, and a number of other states around the country. Actually, Stan was doing it out there at Seward School. He mentioned Seward. Back in the early 70s, you had models that looked just like this. Anyway, what we said, we would go into general ed and train general ed teachers to collect this kind of data and to cycle through the process like this. Stage one would be classroom interventions, where classroom teachers try different interventions, collect data. If kids don't respond, you go to stage two, where a building team looks at the data, looks at your growth, and if kids don't respond, then you go to a special ed evaluation. I think Eiseldike's got some research that says special ed referral usually means special ed identification, but in this model, you're really taking a look at the data ahead. And that's really here, when teams are looking at the data, they start talking about the interventions. Well, what have you been trying? And I will have to tell you that it's a stronger model here than here, because there are the teachers working by themselves. Some teachers may be data-oriented, but it's still a concept that we got to focus on. That's one reason why it's really nice that we have these schools collecting fall, winter, spring CBM data. They collect it school-wide, and then we can feed that back, and then teachers can access that data and take a look at it. Now, ideally, you'd have more than fall, winter, spring, and I showed you graphs, and Stan showed you graphs earlier of weekly monitoring. That is the kind of monitoring that we do normally in special education or with more severe kids. We're not at that point in regular education. Regular education, it's basically a fall, winter, spring model. Well, and this would be an example. Ideally, this would be an example. We do have some schools that do this, but more often than not, our schools are fall, winter, spring. But this is a kid in general education getting Title I help. Not much is happening. A change is made in instruction, and actually 2 changes were made. They went from 3 times to 5 times per week on the Title I help, and they started doing some more phonemic awareness, phonics instruction, a lot of work on decoding, and you can see the increases. So this would be a student in stage 2 that does not go on to special education. But in the old days, being stalled out here, that might be a student that would go into special education. Anyway, I wanted to share with you the problem-solving model because it's a way that we try to look at the data and where CBM would be a component, in addition to other teacher measures and other informal measures. And then the next 6 slides, and I'm going to go through them really fast, are grade levels 1 through 6. And what it shows is the level of performance of the kids in the fall and where they end up in the spring. For general ed, for kids that go to stage 1 interventions, stage 2, which are the building team, and then stage 3, which are evaluated for special ed. And then, of course, not surprisingly, there are differences in the fall, as you would expect. And what's always kind of interesting is to look at their growth across time. So we'll quickly go through this, but the patterns are fairly similar across grades. Sorry, the yellow doesn't really show up. I think the yellow is overlapping. Actually, stage 1 and stage 2 kids look pretty close. It's grade 4, grade 5, and grade 6. And our stage 3 kids in grade 6 there are not growing at all fall to spring. We also looked at the kids going to problem-solving teams and discovered that back in '97, when we really kind of got into this full throttle, about 50% of the kids that went to a team did not go on special ed. Now, about 72% of the kids that go to the team do not go on to special education. So and there's a couple of different ways to look at that. I think there's probably a couple of different factors that account for that. One could just be more kids going to team. But I think another factor is what we really hope is that our stage 2 building teams, as they sit around and talk about instruction, are doing a better job of getting effective instruction to those kids. I know this, we have got a lot more, in the last 5 years, it's been an incredible amount of reading instruction emphasis in our district. And in fact, when that Minnesota Basic Standards test first appeared, we were on page 1 of the Minneapolis Star Tribune because only 33% of our 8th graders passed it. We're now up to the high 50s. So we've gone up 20-some percent, about 25%, which is good. But still, we got a ways to go. Then the last thing I'm going to share with you is disproportion. And I mentioned the Office for Civil Rights came in. They came in, I guess it was the 95-96 school year, and they looked at kids referred to special education and identified for special education, and found that African American kids and Native American kids were referred at high rates and identified at high rates. And our data in Minneapolis were very similar to other large urban districts around the country. They said we were either real high or real low, but we had disproportion, just like all these other urban districts. So what OCR does then, and this was a voluntary compliance agreement, this was not a result of a direct complaint, it was just our turn to be studied. They develop a blueprint for you on how you should attack this. And they had 5 elements, and they said, do a better job at screening and behavior and academics. Okay, identify those kids that are struggling and then get them regular ed intervention. So beef that up. Beef up your teacher training. Provide more intervention strategies in reading, math, and behavior. In the area of special ed, make sure when a kid does go to formal assessment that you're using measures that are not non-discriminatory. And make sure that you never place a student in special ed based, primarily because of their culture or race. And then last, they noticed that we were doing this thing called the problem-solving model at that time. We were just getting it started, and they were out at a few schools where we were just getting it going, and they liked it, and they encouraged us. They said, this would be a good way, because, when you read these sections, they're very similar to what the problem-solving model is. And, progress monitoring, screening, progress monitoring, trying best practice interventions. So that gave us a way to get CBM more expanded throughout the district. It started in the district in the early 80s in special education, but now we have almost 50 schools that are collecting data fall, winter, spring, okay? 50 out of our 60-some elementaries. And so what the teachers do then is they'll look at the data, they'll document their interventions, they'll talk about it in the team, and you may have some data like this at the schools that are collecting on a frequent basis. And then we also mentioned behavior earlier. We had to have a behavior screener. We developed our own 12-item checklist. Of course, you can't read that. We had teachers do a simple 1 to 5 rating on these different areas, and we add up all the scores. And kids that hit a certain cut point, we try an extra intervention with them, where we try behavior intervention. And I'm going really fast through this, but basically, what I wanted to show you is the relationship of behavior with words correct. A perfect score on our screener. Our screener goes, a good score is a low score, and a high score is a bad score. It's kind of like golf, right? And 12 is a perfect score, okay? And here we've got a sample size of 180 kids. Well, that's what their words correct look like. 80, they went from 80 to over 100. Fall to winter. Kids that scored in the 20s, well, they're only reading about 50 words, and they grew up to 80. And then those kids that scored really high in the behavior screener with a lot of difficulties in fighting, social relationships, and things like that, they're only reading about 40 words in the fall. So, and that's at 3rd grade.
Now, is there an intervention on behavior
Yeah,
between the pink bar and the darker red bar there? Or is this natural growth?
for only, actually only for these kids that score actually 36 and above. 36 and above is where we recommend that a behavior intervention be used. Okay, so then the teachers have to document what they're doing in the problem, within the problem-solving model.
So a higher score is bad.
Yes, yeah, kind of like your Bell score, Steve. What happened with disproportion? Back in '97, 44% of our district was African American, and I'm going to just talk about '97 first. But if you looked at referrals to the support teams, 64% of the kids referred were African American. So it's really that discrepancy. That's what OCR wanted us to attend to. Okay, evaluated for special ed, 69%. And if you looked at all the kids where a new IEP was written, it was 69%. So it's that difference between 44 and 69 that OCR said, we want you to do something about, and that's what the blueprint is all about. So as of 2000, so we phased in that agreement that I talked about. We didn't do it district-wide overnight. We roughly did 20 schools at a time each year. So after about, I think it was 3 years, we had data on about 50 schools. This is what their data looked like. We actually had some impact. So even though the enrollment was about the same, about 45% of the kids African American, those kids where a new IEP was written, 55% were African American. So we reduced the discrepancy, but there's still over a 10-point difference, okay? And that was really good. And at that time, I really thought, hey, maybe we got this thing turned around. Well, we didn't, because as we continued to phase in, you know, that sort of reflects the data I just showed you. We had a reversal. And then last year, and then we ended our phase in with everybody. This is what our data looked like. We had a nice downward trend. So that's where we sit right now. We monitor that every year, and we feed it back to OCR. And the reason I show you that is that the CBM has an important role in that, in terms of the screening and looking at student progress part. We look at related to disproportion and bias. We take a look at, we can look at the ethnic groups fall to spring, look at their growth. When you get learning slopes or differences that are really extreme, you have a gap, and then you need to do something. And that's something we encourage all of our schools to look at. And this is kind of some interesting data. It looks at white American and African American kids below the 25th percentile. These would be the kids we'd be focusing on in OCR. And this is some data we collected a couple of years ago, and it's interesting. It does seem like we've closed the gap at those grade levels. At other grade levels, we didn't have that. It wasn't as pronounced as that. We did have gaps, but at least at a couple, something seemed to be going on. That is a whirlwind tour of what we're doing in Minneapolis schools and building on the research that Stan started in 1976, 77, something like that, and how we're trying to incorporate it. So, should we open it up for questions now?
Please.
Yeah.
I'm curious about whether you have any of this program in CBM or have any data of you mostly topped out at about eighth grade. You didn't say a lot about, say, 10th grade, 11th grade.
We have
What do
collected
we know?
data. We did that about 2 or 3 years ago, and we collected data fall to spring with 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, and we found some ceiling effects. We didn't find a whole lot of growth from 10th, 11th, and 12th. But at the same time, we still know it's important data. We maybe aren't seeing the growth, but we still know that that magic number for passing the MBST remains about 150 words, 145 to 155 words. And so we give that information to our teachers, and we do give them passages. We do have passages, and what we have is the packet materials for basically grades 7 through 12, and we have passages for 7th grade, and then we have passages for 8th grade. and then we encourage the older ones to use the 8th grade passages. So it does sort of stop at that level.
Do you have any data on correlation between that stuff and, say, the ACT or SAT?
No.
In regards to your original question, I was showing you some data that my colleague Chris Espin had generated in the area of written expression. Those are 10th grade data, so it looks like the writing measure might turn out that the writing measure in terms of literacy might be more useful for 10th and 11th graders actually than the reading measures, which seem to be at that point when the individual is developed a sort of a proficient level of reading in that construct. You move from learning to read to reading to learn, and so now you're into other ways of looking at learning and subject matter content. Actually, Chris Espin has done a little bit of repeated measurement of vocabulary learning and subject matter too for high school students.
Yeah.
I just wonder how much input you've had into standards development in Minnesota. The second grade standards that were shown earlier were problematic, and it seems to me that if you've got an excellent graduation test that you seem to rely upon, and it seems to correlate with CBM, why don't they move backwards into developing the standards from those? I mean, doesn't that make sense to align?
Yeah.
And have they?
Well, we are making some inroads with the state. They've been expressing some interest in CBM work and using it as a way to benchmark or to monitor progress. In fact, they funded Bob Wales group, the Consortium for
Reading
Evidence.
Center.
Yeah. And it came up with about $200,000 to support doing that and going out to schools. So there has been some movement in that area.
You also have a pretty good set of teacher standards. I mean, it seems to me you could just move backwards from those too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I don't know what your experience
Yeah,
has been with respect to standard setting, but our experience is that it's really done. I don't want to say it's political, but it's the state agency just gets together groups of people who just sort of decide on what ought to be taught, and they're not empirical. They're not empirical about it, and they're not. They don't draw upon knowledge experts in the subject matter necessarily.
Yeah, and
it's quite arbitrary, I think.
Even the professional standards in that area. I mean, professional standards in that area, IRA standards wouldn't indicate that you start at second grade that way. I mean, obviously they've tried to take some sort of outcome and bring it down, but they haven't done it successfully. And it doesn't make sense. You guys should go up there.
Yeah.
We'll send Stan.
Yeah, all right.
I want to ask something that sort of moves more to because I was going to say, well, seems to work. So you've persuaded me, the last 2.5 hours with 100 slides and all this data that you're onto something over here. But to come back to your metaphor of the vital signs, well, you won't find anybody, those also are good predictors. They don't tell you what's wrong, but the vital signs tell you there's something going on or not. But there's no debate, there's no doctor, we don't have a 15% adoption amongst doctors of testing vital signs when you walk in, or a 5%, or you need to, everybody uses the vital signs. So the question is, as you look towards productizing all of this stuff, because that's really right, expansion and rollout and productizing it and getting in future investment and a partnership with ETS and all of that kind of stuff. What are some of the barriers to people adopting this if the thing seems so obvious that, so why isn't everybody doing it, or what are some of the barriers to it, or is it just like a lot of other good ideas that just take time to catch on? What do you think, based on what you've seen over all these years?
Well, of course, in the case of doctors and the vital signs, you have the issue of best practice and malpractice. And so there's a kind of legally based accountability system in medicine that assures that you better use what is understood to be appropriate medical practice. You don't have that kind of legally based accountability system in education. Up to this point, people have been free to choose to do things or not do things and not be held accountable. I do believe that with whatever else you might say about No Child Left Behind and the state standards testing and stuff like that, that has introduced into education a level of accountability for student achievement and student outcomes that has actually made our work much, much easier. So now, when we talk to people about the fact that these scores will indeed predict kids' success on state standards, the level of interest is much greater, and there is this understanding that I need to get my kids to these levels of achievement and so forth. And that's there now, Simi, that was not ever there before. So a lot of the data that we've showed you, these hundreds of slides that we've showed you, have been generated in the last 10 years really, since statewide testing has started, because now, where we used to have to go out and administer the Stanford Achievement Test or the Stanford Diagnostic Reading Test in order to get the data, we don't have to do that anymore. What do? We just go to the school district in the state and we get the state standards data. So all we have to do is our end of it, which is to collect the CBM type data now and start looking at its relationship to those state standards. So there is, I think, a context and a pressure now that is going to result in increased amounts of this going on. And indeed, in the early reading first grants, which are preceding, have been in place for the last couple of years, that's precede No Child Left Behind, there's a requirement for collecting oral reading fluency data as part of the early reading first grants. And so states that get early reading first grants have to collect oral reading CBM data and are doing that. So that now Doug actually has some thoughts on barriers. I mean, you talked about, and can I think speak to a little more to some of the barriers that he's faced and the way that they've been addressed. Is that right, Doug?
Well, I mean, a key variable always is time. Teachers say, well, where do I get the time to collect this data? And then there's the barrier of using paper, pencil, and management of data. And that's where the discussion of linking with discourse and a technology that helps organize that data and maybe graph it is can play a major role and make it more efficient and easier for teachers. So that's certainly something.
As an example of that, more of my work has been in St. Paul schools, where Doug, of course, and Stan as well, because of the proximity to the university, has been more in Minneapolis. Now, through Stan and Doug's work, Minneapolis has implemented over this long period of time having teachers, staff, graduate students listen to children read and record these numbers. That's a very labor-intensive process. But the data that comes out of it and the impact even at the state level that this has had about the data once that is there, you could see its utility and its power. Now, St. Paul, on the other side, has not done this same thing, but they are, through what we have done in St. Paul, they are as influenced when they have the data as Minneapolis is. But they aren't willing to institute the high level of labor required to have every child read to them and score them and write down the data and put them and get it into the computer. And they don't have a Doug Marston and the staff that he has that looks at that data. Now that's where it started to occur to me, working on the discourse side of it, that if we can just get them the data in an inexpensive, usable way, these things happen almost. To me, it's a little magical, because the work that I did in Highwood Hills with putting data, the CBM data on the discourse format, and then just turning around and handing the charts to the teachers and say, meet in grade level teams and talk about this. And the power that a line has going up or down, indicating growth, is enormous. Because the teachers see that going up, and the teachers will, I was listening in on these meetings at grade levels, and teachers did not know the meaning of the data, but they knew that a line going up was good. And so teachers would look at the other teachers' charts and say, well, my line's not going up and yours is. What are you doing? And so that begins a conversation that extends to throughout the school about what are you doing? What kind of kids do you have? What kind of resources do you have? What kind of approaches are you using? But it's all predicated on having that information, the indicators that are useful, simple to get. And so applying the discourse technology to this is a way. And as I think it was Stan that showed the slide of the other products that are there. All those are technology-based. So this is happening nationally, that technology, but discourse has a unique power to collect, because we've done this, an entire school of data in one day.
Well, the design, that slide, for me, that slide that Stan had about sort of what are the design requirements, I think that was the most, it's kind of easy to do, you can do it often, it's unintrusive, you had like your 6 bullets over there from the very beginning. And I think that the technology can accelerate each one of those, those requirements by an order of magnitude that might help you cross that threshold as to say, will they do it and then use it? Because it sounds like with a lot of things, once they've done it and they got the data, then they're pleased to have it and then they'll act on it. That is kind of crossing the threshold is just to decide to implement the collection, and that's really where the sort of the bone is stuck in this, right?
Well, Steve said that those other products are all technology-based. They are technology-based, but all of them require manual scoring and data entry.
That's right. And then they put it in the computers.
And then it's technology.
I'm sure Doug will attest that